Europe confronts an increasingly fragile security landscape, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky's high-stakes tour has entered a decisive phase. After sealing a major defense framework in France, he arrives in Spain today seeking urgent commitments. His government is now heavily dependent on European backing as US engagement declines, and Kyiv's need to sustain military financial assistance grows increasingly desperate. Yet Europe itself faces rising economic pressures, with several government warnings that large-scale, long-term support for Ukraine could strain their already fragile budgets. This comes as Russian strikes intensify, pushing European leaders to accelerate military planning. At the same time, Germany's foreign minister warns of a possible future confrontation between Russia and NATO member states, deepening fears of escalation across the continent. Is Europe entering a new era of armament? Will Zelensky's tour secure real military support or merely political symbolism? And can Europe carry Ukraine's burden without triggering its own financial crisis? We're going to attempt to answer these questions here on Think Tank. Welcome.
Our world is becoming unhinged.
New York Times has reported that Ukraine's cash reserves are dwindling and the European Union has no good fallback if its main financing plan collapses. For months, EU officials have focused on using frozen central bank assets from Russia in Belgium to generate a €140 billion loan for Ukraine's war efforts. But Belgium unexpectedly blocked the plan, warning it could be liable if Russia sues or demands repayment. Brussels has proposed alternatives, joint EU borrowing or direct grants from the member states. Yet both options are costly and politically difficult for already indebted governments. Despite the legal and financial complications, policymakers say the frozen asset loan remains the only viable path. The Commission acknowledges that risk that the loan could be perceived as confiscation even as Russia threatens retaliation. With Ukraine facing a major budget gap and time running out before March or April, Europe enters weeks of fraught negotiations with no easy answer. Spain promised to roll out an unspecified substantial aid package for Ukraine as President Volodymyr Zelenskyy visited Madrid and met the Spanish defense minister and sector executives, aiming to bolster Kyiv's air defenses against Russia. The Ukrainian leader's European trip comes amid a surge of Russian drone and missile attacks on Ukraine in recent weeks. Zelenskyy said he expected a productive visit that would result in agreements that will give Ukraine greater strength. Spain in February said it would provide Ukraine with a new military aid package worth €1 billion this year as part of a 10-year bilateral security and defense agreement signed in May 2024. He is also expected to raise with Sanchez the issue of potential financing for Ukraine's energy sector and frozen Russian assets. Zelensky's visit to Spain follows a trip to Greece and France, where he signed an agreement to buy up to 100 French-made Rafale warplanes over the next 10 years. After Madrid, Zelenskyy will travel to Turkey on Wednesday, where he is expected to coincide with U.S. Special Envoy Steve Witkoff for talks about reviving hopes of a potential peace deal with Russia.
President Volodymyr Zelensky's latest tour of Europe has become one of his most critical diplomatic efforts since the start of the Russia-Ukraine war. In France, he secured an initial agreement to purchase up to 100 Rafale fighter jets, The deal is long-term, with funding still incomplete, but it signals Europe's intention to expand Ukraine's air capabilities. The visit came as Russian drone and missile strikes continue to hit Ukrainian cities, making air defense a top priority. Zelenskyy then heads to Spain, hoping that it will be another powerful country joining Ukraine's allies in the initiatives needed, as he described. The visit takes place nearly a month after Spanish Prime Minister Pedro Sánchez revealed that Spain would join the Prioritized Ukraine Requirements List, PEARL, a NATO framework designed to support Ukraine by jointly procuring US-supplied weaponry. This tour unfolded amid growing European fears of a broader conflict. German Foreign Minister warned that Russia may be capable of launching an attack on a NATO member state as early as 2028-2029, urging Europe to accelerate its military buildup in response to Moscow's growing arsenal. In addition to the security concerns, Europe will likely struggle financially while maintaining its support for Ukraine. European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen said Ukraine would require 135.7 billion euros over the next 2 years to meet its military and fiscal needs. She outlined 3 possible avenues for EU governments: direct national contributions, issuing new joint debt, or drawing on frozen Russian assets. While the United States scaling down its engagement, Europe now faces the challenge of sustaining Ukraine militarily and politically, while navigating its own escalating security and financial challenges.
For more analysis, we're now joined from Brussels by Canada Director Romanowska, Professor of EU Law and Security Studies, and Nicholas Williams, a former NATO official. Thank you both for joining us. Now, Dr. Kamada, let's start off by asking, Zelenskyy arrives in Spain today after sealing the Rafale framework with France. How does this back-to-back tour reflect on Ukraine's need for European backing at this stage of the war?
Well, we have to look at it from a bit broader perspective. Zelensky's back-to-back visits to France and to Spain are not simply a European tour. They reflect the very urgent need to rebuild momentum with these 2 countries. While supported, have often been more cautious than the frontline states. Paris and Madrid are sophisticated actors. They look at Ukraine not only through the lens of battlefield necessity, but through broader strategic questions. Their role in the NATO, their interest in Africa, migration pressure, and the system challenges that Russia now possesses well beyond Eastern Europe. So Zelenskyy now is in the effect of winning them back, reminding them that Ukraine fight is directly linked to their own strategic vulnerabilities. For France, the connection is clear. Russia expanding footprint in Sahel has pushed French forces and influences out of Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso. And that vacuum now is being filled by Russian military contractors, disinformation cells, and resources extraction deals. Paris understands that Russia victory in Ukraine will amplify Moscow reach in Africa, further eroding French influence and weakening European southern flank. That's why the Rafale framework matters for Paris, not only as industry policy, but as strategic counterweight in the war where Russia is encroaching on France's traditional zone of influence. For Spain, on the other hand, the urgency is different, but equally pressing. Madrid is facing hybrid pressures from Russia, including manipulation of irregular migration routes via North Africa and to Las Islas Canarias. Spain's intelligence service have openly warned that some of the recent surges in irregular crossings show signs of coordinated destabilization effort. To that, Russia growing digital and disinformation operation in Spain, including targeting elections and far-right mobilization. For Spain, then, the war is not an abstraction. It's a part of a wider hybrid threat environment.
But what does this say? I mean, I understand that this obviously directly affects EU member states, including Spain and France and even Germany. But what does this actually mean for the Ukrainians? I mean, you can see that Zelenskyy is basically jetting around Europe, trying to get weapons. Does this mean that the state of the Ukraine war is quite devastating on the Ukrainians, that they can't sustain it without other help, outside help?
Well, in my opinion, absolutely yes, because what we can see now that the substantial packet is important because Margaret and France, we have a situation in Ukraine is quite devastating, and bearing in mind a very difficult situation when it comes to the recent corruption scandal, the people in Ukraine also need a very important message that Europe is standing behind them, and European countries as well will going to give them a hand in order to ensure that the money and the real support, like weapons, like anti-drone systems, air defense assets, which are linked back to us, for instance, a part of broader strategy, will make Ukraine strong enough that Russia has to divert resources and attention and capacity to reducing the pressure that can apply in a different way. So Zelenskyy is trying the first time, well, give the answer and to certain the people can ask in Ukraine, what is really going on, and diverting interest from corruption scandals and from irregularity scandals and some critics as well towards his effort to win back Europe, and as well showing the world that helping Europe is now the part of its own strategy and not distraction from it. So it is actually something that the Ukraine should interpret as Ukraine urgency behind the Brussels deal as a not only Eastern Front power, but it's something which will be able to be a multi-theater disruptor, including backing juntas that push European partners in Africa or weaponizing migration routes and disinformation. He wished to, in my opinion, to show that this is a strategic investment in European influence, not only the assistance to Ukraine.
Okay, if we can also get Mr. Williams' take here as well. Now, Zelenskyy, as we just said, is touring a few European countries, concluding in Spain. Do you think that this push for air power commitments is something that's critical for the Ukrainians, and how important is it when it comes to this diplomatic push, when it comes to the battlefield survival of Ukraine? They've taken heavy losses in the recent few days.
Well, of course, these trips to Europe, to the United States that Zelenskyy regularly undertakes is crucial for the continuation of the war. He depends on the support of others. In terms of the battlefield and what's going on now, well, Zelenskyy is trying to gain support for next year, assuming that the war will continue into next year. The EU calculates that the war will continue into 2026, end of 2026. And so Zelenskyy is trying to shore up support beyond the immediate circumstances. But the immediate circumstances are critical and I'm afraid desperate for Ukraine. The Russians are advancing ruthlessly, relentlessly, progressively, and the Ukrainians don't have an answer in terms of their manpower and the equipment that they've got at the moment to withstand the Russian onslaught. So if the Ukrainians manage to sustain themselves and defend themselves beyond this year and into next year, yes, the support of the Europeans will be essential to continuing the war. But I'm afraid it may be too late.
But do you think there's also a sense of urgency, as Dr. Kamna there said, that the European partners within the EU also feel the strain? It's not just a Ukrainian-Russian battle, it's an existential threat, I suppose, for the rest of Europe.
Yes, they regard the support to Ukraine as urgent, but if it was a real existential threat to the whole of Europe, not to the Ukraine, then the Europeans would already agreed to send as much money as they can to Ukraine. And the fact that they're arguing about guarantees to Belgium and so on means that there are limits that the Europeans have to defending Ukraine and therefore themselves. They talk rhetorically in terms of defending Ukraine, but there are severe limits, and the Europeans are reaching the limit of what they are willing to support Ukraine on in terms of finance.
Okay, Dr. Kamala, now Spain promised to roll out an unspecified substantial aid package to Ukraine as Zelenskyy is visiting Madrid. What is the significance of this? And do you agree there with Mr. Williams that there's sort of a negotiation process and there really isn't a sense of urgency when it comes to Europe?
Well, we have to see two very important things because first of all, the substantial package signals Spain's recognition that European security now lives on two fronts at once, east and south. And helping Ukraine is in effect forward defense on Mediterranean, Black Sea basin and European maritime neighborhood. And it's really important, bearing in mind that Spain and Madrid is a home of the Union for Mediterranean. So Spain therefore sees you ensuring Ukraine does not collapse is a part of its total security strategy, and that's important. Moreover, we have to take into account that Spain is crucial when connecting Ukraine to transatlantic supply like Turkey and Black Sea basin, where grain routes, naval balance, and critical sea corridors determine the wider stability in the region. But when it comes to Europe, in how Europe interprets Ukraine urgency behind the Rafale agreement, we have to look at this even more in a more bolder perspective, because Europe reads Ukraine urgency as reflection of two realities: declining US engagement and steep escalation of Russian pressures, both at the front and in the wider region. On the battlefield, Russia is breathing forward in several sectors around Kupiansk, Novoavdivka, and in part of Zaporozhye line, taking advantage of Ukrainian more power shortage and delays in Western ammunition deliveries. Ukraine urgently needs to rebuild control over the skies if it's to stabilize the front in 2026 and 2027. But Europe also interprets this urgency globally, because now we can see and we can observe, even though it's slightly taken our issues away, but Moscow is expanding its influence very aggressively in Africa, pushing France out of the Sahel, entrenching itself in Libya, inserting mercenary and intelligence network along Europe's southern periphery. In Black Basin, Russia continues to test Ukrainian ports, undersea cables and maritime routes, directly threatening European food security and stability in the entire regions, as well as our very much strategic partner like Turkey. And this, when it comes to Turkey, this is where its role becomes critical. Control on straits and under Montreux Convention, cooperation with NATO navies, the Ankara balancing diplomacy, all made Turkey a central actor in securing a stable Black Sea environment. And Europe knows that. They know that with a strong Ukraine, Turkey will be a buffer, the only one buffer between Russia and NATO in maritime flank. That's the reason why the Rafale framework is not simply about the fighter jet. It's about Europe acknowledging that Ukraine must be built into long-term air and maritime power. And we have to tell them, because otherwise, when we stabilize the Black Sea region and act as counterweight to Russian adversaries in Africa and Mediterranean, we have to support our strategic partner like Turkey, like Egypt, in order to ensure that the stability in the region will remain.
Okay, Mr. Williams, now let's discuss the Rafale deal here. It requires a massive amount of financing that Europe has not yet secured. From a military perspective, how do funding gaps reshape the Ukrainian expectations? I mean, they've clearly signed a deal, but how are they going to get the planes, I suppose, if there's no financing secured yet?
Yes, first of all, let me repeat what I already said. The Europeans, if they considered the threat from Russia to be existential, then they would do everything they could to withstand the threat in terms of raising taxes, cutting welfare, in order to support Ukraine. But I was saying that there are limits, and if they regarded the threat as existential, then they would do infinitely more. But let me turn to your question. The signature yesterday, in terms of France supplying 100 Rafales, was a letter of intent. The Ukrainians have already signed a similar agreement for 100 aircraft, needed, of course, from Sweden. Much less advanced, but still effective. And the money is not there.
Would you think that, I mean, Dr. Kamda there was talking about how obviously the Ukrainians find this as an existential threat and they need the Rafale planes, but also part of the reason why the Rafale planes are going is because the Europeans see it as an existential threat. Do you think this is an accurate statement, or is it more headed towards the idea that, you know, this is feeding into the military-industrial complex and France is making money out of these Rafale deals, basically?
Existential threat to
yes, Mr. Williams.
To Ukraine, the existential threat to Ukraine. But if Europe, NATO Europe, wishes to, it can defend itself and abandon Ukraine. That's not the language which the Europeans are talking about. They recognize the urgency. They want to support Ukraine. But what I'm saying is that the support, the ability to support Ukraine is running out, or the willingness is running out, because they don't want to do the extra which is necessary to support Ukraine in terms of finance, in terms of supporting Ukraine militarily and in government terms, in terms of the 71 billion euros that would be needed next year to support Ukraine. 71 billion euros that the Europeans will have to find, and they're desperate because they cannot find it.
Okay, Dr. Kamda. Now, the European outlets are saying that Ukraine has become increasingly dependent on Europe, given that the US engagement is waning. Can Europe realistically carry this burden without entering into a severe financial strain, especially that the European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen said Ukraine would require about 135.7 billion euros over the next 2 years to meet the military and fiscal needs?
Well, we have to look at one of the reasons why we can see Mr. Zelenskyy traveling through Europe is as well to remind Europeans that this is as well their own interest. And Europe is less that Zelenskyy would wish unified to share this financial burden, because Europe has a goal, which is preventing Russian victory, but it's less unified on who pays and under what condition. Some states, particularly in the southern end, worry about long-term fiscal support. The burden may fall disproportionately on a small group of willing contributions. This is the reason why we can see that the EU is now building an unprecedented architecture of anti-corruption, fiscal control, and intelligence cooperation around Ukraine support. Funds are continued on reforms and conditioned on the reforms of the judiciary, public procurement, and state aid control. Disbursement under the Ukraine facility require verified benchmarks, even maybe more required and maybe more in-depth control. And EU intelligence service, of course, intelligence in the context of cooperation of various member states, including the cooperation with Frontex, EPPO, and OLAF, and they now routinely track the diversion risk in arms procurement and dual-use goods. At the same time, Europe knows that financial burden is an offset by economic gains, defense industry contract, technology transfer, increased production capability, and stabilization of Black Sea supply chains, which affects Europe agriculture and energy prices. So why not every member state contributes equally Europe is gradually creating a shared system of responsibility backed by oversight, transparency, and intelligence cooperation. It's messy, but it's moving into the right direction. And I think that Mr. von der Leyen is good. If we will see at the values aspect, not only the support for Ukraine, but as well support into the eastern flank to prepare Europe, it's going to be a long-term investment. And I do hope it's going to be well established, because otherwise, if they're going to be corruption scandals, like we heard recently in media regarding the Ukraine, people in Europe will be less and less willing to support them. And this is something we could not actually, in order to survive this situation in a global scale, accept or agree on.
Okay, Mr. Williams, Dr. Kamda there seems to be a bit more optimistic than you are, but European economies are feeling the pressure basically because of Ukraine and their need for rapid air defense expansion, as well as obviously the war that has been prolonged, in addition to the lack of faith because of the corruption scandals. Which system offers the best short-term impact without overwhelming European budgets and also at the same time making the average European person less wary of supporting the Ukrainians?
Well, obviously, what the Ukrainians already have in terms of air defense, of sophisticated air defense, the Patriot system and so on, yes, that's world-beating. But the problem is a Patriot system takes a couple of years to build and deliver and costs $1 billion. The Ukrainians and the Russians, by the way, but the Ukrainians have demonstrated astonishing technological innovation through this war. And but the gaps that are opening up in their air defense has left them exposed to attacks on their gas infrastructure. They can't defend everything. So again, the short term is critical, and there's no help that I can foresee that will quickly plug the gaps until next year. And this is what the Russians are exploiting, this collapse or potential collapse of the Ukrainian defense over the winter. And so there is no short-term solution.
So you think that the Ukrainians will basically suffer heavy losses in the short-term future?
Well, they'll suffer heavy losses on the battlefield, but the morale and the comfort of the Ukrainian people over this winter is deliberately being targeted by the Russians in terms of increasing their attacks on the gas infrastructure. And it will, the Russians are saying resistance is futile.
Okay, Dr. Kemner, if we can get a quick answer in now. Germany is warning that there's a possibility of a confrontation between Russia and NATO members by 2028. This obviously stirred debate. In your opinion, do you think this warning is used to basically justify increasing defense spending and helping out the Ukrainians?
Well, first of all, we have to say that Berlin intelligence is working quite well, I have to say, even for there are some safeguards which are limiting their capabilities. And what Berlin is trying to convey is that Europe has no time left. If Russia rebuilds the conventional forces by 2028, 2029, that's what Bundeswehr intelligence suggests, Europe could face adversary capable to pressuring NATO, while still destabilizing Africa, Arctic, and Black Sea. So there is a deeper point than just financial. Germany knows that Europe does not, Germany knows that if Europe does not invest now, the eventual cost will be exponentially higher. Defense is expensive, but war on European soil is simply unaffordable.
Okay.
So the
Yeah, I have to cut you off there. I'm sorry, but we're out of time. That was Kamla Zarekta Romanowska, Professor of EU Law and Security Studies from London. We're joined by Mr. Nicholas Williams, a former NATO official. Thank you both for your insights and thank you for joining us here. This brings us to the end of today's episode of Think Tank, which always unveils the complex world we live in. Thank you for watching and stay tuned for more updates here on Qnews.